Order. Now call the Standing Committee on Public Accounts to order. My name is Kelly Regan, and I'm the chair of this committee. And I want to welcome everyone on what is for many Nova Scotians the first day of school. I know some people started yesterday, but thanks everybody for making it and dropping any children off early. Much appreciated. Just a reminder here, folks, that we need you to place your phones on silent, and I will ask my committee members to introduce themselves. And I'll first welcome Kendra Coombs as a new member of the committee. Ms. Coombs.
Hi, good morning. Kendra Coombs, MLA for Cape Breton Centre, Whitney Pier.
Ms. LeBlanc.
Thanks. Good morning. Susan LeBlanc, MLA for Dartmouth North.
Mr. Tilley.
Hi, Fred Tilley, MLA Northside Westmount.
Mr. Young.
Morning, everyone. Nolan Young, MLA for Shelburne County.
Mr. Ritzie.
Good morning, everyone. Dave Ritzie, MLA for Truro, Bobble Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Mr. McDonald.
Good morning. John A. McDonald, MLA for Hants East.
Ms. Sheehy-Richard.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I'm Melissa Sheehy-Richard, the MLA for Hants West.
And Mr. Bourgeois.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, everyone. Trevor Boudreau, the MLA for Richmond.
Thank you, everyone. I will note that officials from the Auditor General's Office, Legislative Council Office, Hansard, and Legislative Committee's Office are in attendance as well. On today's agenda, we have officials with us from the Department of Communities, Culture, Tourism and Heritage, Department of Finance and Treasury Board, and Department of Natural Resources and Renewables with respect to the 2022 follow-up report of the Auditor General regarding grant programs. Chapter 1, May 29th, 2018, report of the Auditor General. So I am going to ask the witnesses to introduce themselves, beginning with Mr. Greenlaw.
Hi, my name is Bill Greenlaw. I'm the Executive Director at CCTH. Thank you.
Deputy Huston.
My name is Justin Huston. I'm the Deputy Ministers for Community, Culture, Tourism and Heritage, as well as ONU Affairs.
Mr. Shore.
Hi, I'm Christopher Shore, Executive Director at CCTH.
Deputy Dean.
Morning, I'm Kelliann, Dean, Deputy Minister for Finance and Treasury Board.
Mr. Bourgeois.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Robert Bourgeois. I'm the Executive Director of Government Accounting within Finance and Treasury Board.
Mr. Parker.
Good morning, I'm Matt Parker. I'm the Executive Director of Forestry and Wildlife with Natural Resources and Renewables.
Deputy Gatien.
Good morning, I'm Karen Gatien. I'm the Deputy Minister of Natural Resources and Renewables.
And last but not least, Mr. O'Brien.
Good morning, Mike O'Brien, Executive Director of Finance, supporting natural resources and renewables.
So I will invite the deputies to make opening remarks, and we'll begin first with Deputy Dean.
Thank you, Madam Chair and committee members. Thank you for the opportunity to be here to answer questions about the Auditor General's May 2018 chapter and recommendations on grant programs. At this time, grant programs within the Government of Nova Scotia are designed and administered by individual departments. There are general controls for all expenditures across government, and we ensure departments are aware of their obligations. As the Auditor General's Office notes in the report, the delivery of grant programs varies in each department. We have accepted the Auditor General's recommendation that my department, in consultation with the Executive Council Office, should develop a framework to provide guidance to public sector entities on best practices for grant program design, administration, and monitoring of compliance at program design level. I'm pleased to inform the committee that work on this recommendation has moved forward, and we are on track to have a formal grants management policy included in the province's Corporate Administrative Policy Manual by the end of this calendar year. This is an important initiative that affects all of government, and the Department of Finance and Treasury Board supports a more consistent approach to administering grants. Implementing this recommendation required our department to do a considerable amount of consultation across government to review departmental grant programs and assess commonalities and differences. Understandably, the pace of this work was also impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. We also took the time to consider and implement the recommendations the Auditor General's office put forward about COVID-19 support programs as it relates to this new policy. We greatly value the role of the Auditor General. Her office does important work, and our department has a strong working relationship with the Auditor General and her staff. Thank you for the opportunity to say a few words, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Deputy Dean. Deputy Huston.
Good morning, and thanks for inviting us here today. We look forward to discussing the great work that's underway to update our grants management processes to address the Auditor General's recommendations. And I'll use my opening time to give context for this work at the Department of Communities, Culture, Tourism, and Heritage. The mandate of the department is fundamentally about supporting Nova Scotia's people and communities. A significant majority of our budget, about $91 million this year, is invested directly in communities through grants and funding programs. We support everything from sport and recreation, to artists and musicians, to African Nova Scotian community organizations, to French and Gaelic language development, to active living projects that help build healthier communities. In the past 2 years, film and tourism have joined the department, and we invest millions to help local creators and operators and grow these important sectors of our economy. We agree completely with the Auditor General's recommendations to strengthen how we measure performance and ensure our programs are as effective as possible. When I joined the department in 2019, the work was well underway, and then of course in 2020, COVID hit. CCTH played a critical role in government's response to the pandemic. Staff were in constant conversation with sector partners in the arts, culture, sport, and tourism sectors to create new funding programs and supports to help them navigate and recover from the pandemic. In some ways, this did slow our response to the Auditor General's report, as we had to refocus our priorities. But it also spurred us to be nimble and adaptive in how we meet the needs of the communities we serve, which really is the heart of what we do. So over the past 2 years, we've also undertaken, in conjunction with our review of the Auditor General recommendations, an extensive program improvement project, which we're in the final phase of now. We've worked to improve areas the Auditor General noted, like consistency and documentation, but we're also focused on equity, diversity, and inclusion. Staff have reached out to people who've received funding, but also those who were unsuccessful applicants or may have never applied to us before. We're identifying where our barriers may be. And one thing that's clear, especially in communities that have been historically underserved by government, is that we can't copy and paste our processes or take a one-size-fits-all approach. That's not equitable. So I'm pleased to say we've made major progress on many of the report's recommendations. We've updated guidelines, applications, and reporting to ensure that applicants link their project to the program's objectives. We developed tools and hosted training sessions to ensure we're embedding risk assessment in all our programs. But we're also making sure that our processes are accessible and meet the needs of the communities that we serve. I'll turn it over to Deputy Gatien now to say a few words. Thank you.
Deputy Gatien.
Good morning, and thank you for this opportunity to speak to how we are managing our grants programs. I'd first like to say that we always welcome insight from the Auditor General's office to help us continuously improve our service to Nova Scotians. Managing taxpayer dollars wisely and investing them in quality programs that have real benefits for Nova Scotians is something we take very seriously. It's important to have performance indicators for our programs so that we know they are having the intended positive impact for Nova Scotians. And it's also important to have proper controls in place to ensure taxpayer dollars are managed appropriately. And we need to continuously monitor to ensure controls are followed and performance standards are met. When the audit we're speaking about today was done, we were the Department of Natural Resources. At that time, the department had 9 programs and 3 of them were audited. I'm pleased to report that we've completed all of our work to apply the Auditor General's recommendations to all 9 of those programs that were with the former Natural Resources Department. We completed the first 3 programs by the fall of 2020 and the remaining 6 by December 21. We've also reviewed and improved our approach to agreements with third parties to include clear performance expectations, reporting requirements, and conflict of interest guidelines. This work was completed in August of 2019. While that completes our commitments to the audit in question, we agree that the Auditor General's recommendations should be applied to all grant programs. That's why we're doing the necessary work to determine if any adjustments are needed to grant programs within the energy and mines portfolios. that we gained when our current Department of Natural Resources and Renewables was formed a year ago. If any adjustments are needed to meet the recommendations, we will certainly make them. We're very fortunate to have the ability to help so many Nova Scotians through our grant programs. We're committed to continuous improvement to ensure that they are well managed and give Nova Scotians value for their tax dollars. And we're very happy to take your questions today as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So each caucus will have 20 minutes to start for questioning, and all of the witnesses here are not grizzled veterans, but they're veterans of this chamber. So you'll know that I may have to interrupt you in the middle of full rhetorical flight, simply because we've reached the 20-minute mark. So just wanted to give a reminder of that. So first we will begin with the Liberal caucus and Mr. Tilley.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you all for being here today, and thank you for your presentations. I just have a few questions, just mostly for my own knowledge, I guess, and for others. But when you're looking at a new grant for whatever particular reason, and I'll throw this out to whomever wants to answer it, or multiple answers, what process do we go through to determine a need for a new grant program? Is there a specific streamlined process we go through, or does it differ by department?
Deputy Huston.
I'll start trying to answer that question, and then my colleagues can hop in. So we have approximately 77 different grant programs in our department alone. And so they've evolved over the years. Some have existed for quite some time, years, several years, decades, and others are relatively new. I'd say it's quite an iterative process, and it's responsive to what we hear from communities or the sectors that we work with. So our staff, one of the things that our department prides itself on is having a very close connection between staff and the sectors that they work with or the communities that they serve. And so there are constant conversations, whether it's through formal stakeholder tables such as the Nova Scotia Arts Council, or it's more informal, it's just feet on the ground and people in community, and hearing what's needed, what's working, what isn't working, and being flexible and nimble to adapt to the needs of the community. So by and large, it's quite I would say, it's tailor-made to in terms of what the sector is looking for and or the communities are looking for. And we really try to be responsive and not be a one-size-fits-all. So they can vary by region as well, but we try to be as responsive as we can.
Mr. Tilley.
Thank you for that answer. So just further on that, so vary by region. So based on the needs of a particular region, overall grant can change based on the region?
Mr. Deputy Huston.
Perhaps not the actual the program objectives, but for example, and I can turn to my colleague, Executive Director Greenlaw here as well to explain. So for example, with some of our recreation development facilities, we work closely with the needs of the municipalities and the local communities to understand, in one area it might be very rich in rinks. We don't need more rinks, but we need other accessible trail systems. And so it's working to understand what the needs are of the community to fulfill that. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Bill, at all?
Mr. Greenlaw?
Yeah, sure. Just to add on to what Deputy Huston just said, another way that we look at developing grants is looking at the government's agenda. Sometimes grants or awards, grant systems are a result of the campaigns going out on your platform commitments. So I would use the example of the Rink Revitalization Program as a program that was initiated by from your party platform. Similarly, in the previous government, the Trails Grant Program, the $1 million that was invested in by the previous government was a platform commitment that was there. And the other way that grants can be looked at, in addition to what Deputy Huston said, is that for our proposal-based grant program, so like we partnered with the Department of Community Services on their poverty reduction strategy, and we developed Building Vibrant Communities grants. So in the Building Vibrant Communities grants, we noticed that there was a lot of need for food insecurity or to address food insecurity. And you notice that the department evolved and created the food security grant programs as a result of that. So it is iterative, it evolves, and we really listen to what the sector has to say, and of course take direction from those elected officials. Thank you.
Mr. Tilley?
Thank you, Madam Chair. With regards to grants, Deputy Huston mentioned that there are some grants that are very old and some that are very new. Is there a process for sunsetting grants, or I guess we would look more along the lines of need? How does the sunset process work with grants?
Deputy Huston?
Sure. So there's a couple of different levels where we look at that. So I'll take us a moment, and I'm sure I'll talk about this at length and responding to another question, so I won't go into too much detail, but we're going through what we call a program improvement process, where we've been working across all the divisions of the department, and we're working with all our staff as well as extensive conversations with external stakeholders to look at the way that the programs that exist, are they the right programs? Are they serving the communities that need it most? And the sectors, are they geared and are they shaped the way that will be most effective? And if they're not, how can we change them? And we're looking at the way that they're actually administered as well. So that's a more comprehensive formal process where we would look at and say, okay, you know what, this program isn't working, or it served its need at the time, but things have changed. And we're evolving into it. So, we have a limited budget. So if we're creating a new program, we've got to sunset another program. And so we will work in the case of, let's say it's within, say, the tourism industry or a particular sector, we'll work with our partners to understand which of those programs need to evolve and either, sunset or change and be adapted to move into a different direction. So there's sort of two levels. One would be more corporate, holistic look at things, and we look at our budget every year to see what's relevant. And then the other would be within the sectors or directly with some of our offices like Gaelic Affairs or Acadian Affairs or African Nova Scotian Affairs, who are in touch with communities to understand what the needs are on the ground.
Do either of the other two deputies have anything they would like to add to that particular conversation? Deputy Dean?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think what I would add is, I think what Deputy Huston is describing, the process that department goes through to make sure that their programming supports their clients. And Deputy Gatien would have, similar processes that she would have to go through. What we're trying to do with the new policy is make sure there's a level of consistency and approach across government. And so there's a pre-award phase. There's actually like a life cycle of a grant, and it would start with a pre-award phase, and that's what Deputy Huston was talking about in terms of design. How will I design the program? What are the things that I need to take into account to make sure that it's going to be effective? And then the policy will also outline some guidelines for departments to follow around how to actually award it. And then your question around evaluation would be in the post-award portion of a grant life cycle, so that would take into account how you're going to monitor, how you're going to evaluate, and how you would introduce some consistency in the approach. The actual programs themselves, they will vary across departments because the clients are so different and the program areas are so different and some of the risk levels are different. But what we hope to do with the policy is provide tools, best practices, and guidance, so that takes a lot of the guesswork out of it for departments. So instead of having to design every stage themselves, there'll be a best practice guideline that they can follow. So I think that will provide some consistency across departments.
Deputy Gatien?
Yeah, I don't have a lot new to add. I just want to affirm that that's exactly the process that we're following, and what I mentioned in my opening remarks with respect to the former Energy and Mines portfolio. We're using that kind of risk assessment first of all, and that'll help guide us in terms of, are there changes needed to align with this common approach? But similar to Deputy Huston, any grants, the budget's pretty finite. So we're not really in the business of creating new grant programs at this point, but certainly it's important as well in terms of continuous improvement to look at the ones that we do offer to say, are they still relevant? So in terms of, sure, they might meet the risk threshold and they may be administered perfectly, but maybe they're not really meeting a need that the sector or community needs. So those are the things that we will look at as well.
Mr. Tilley.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So that kind of leads me into the idea of tracking the performance of grants. So when we're looking at sunsetting or when we're looking at changing grants, what's the current process that we go through around setting performance indicators on grants? And is that a standardized process or is it program specific? I'm sure there's some overarching indicators that we look for to see how successful grants are.
Deputy Gatien.
Speak to what we've done. Sorry, I didn't wait. I can speak to what we've done at Natural Resources and Renewables. And remember, this is the natural resources side. We'll do the same on the former energy and mines. So we develop logic models for our grant programs, and so that's sort of if you've seen a logic model, it kind of works through kind of inputs, outputs, outcomes, kind of what are the activities that will take place, and gives you something to measure against. So what's your process? What's the process you're going to follow? And is the grant actually, the activities aligned with the grant that an organization is delivering, is it following our intended outcomes? And then, or sorry, our intended activities. And then the actual outcome evaluation would measure what's actually the result of that. And so we look at all of that as the evaluation is done. And evaluations are typically done on a yearly basis. And we give clear performance indicators up front to the organizations to say, here are our expectations for your program. And then when they give us the reports, financial, there's probably some narrative involved, as well as the outcome analysis, then we would compare that to say, are they actually achieving what it is that we've requested them to achieve? And does our corresponding agreement with them clearly outline for them that that's what's required? So we're kind of always looking at that and hoping to improve. And we will, following the risk assessment that we're doing with the other, I think it's approximately 17 grants with former energy and mines, we'll start to develop the logic models aligned with that as well to start that process if they're required. Many of them may not need them because maybe they're running exactly the way that we would intend them to run.
Would either of the other two deputies like to? Deputy Huston?
Thank you. I can probably speak at length of it, but I'll try to keep it relatively short just in the interest of availability for further questions. So I think it's important to say that, you know, this relates directly to the OAG's recommendation 1.2, which is around the departments establishing performance indicators, measure performance, and regularly and we completely agree with that recommendation. And it's something that we already do in the work, all of our grant programs. Where I think the Auditor General really helped us to focus was around that consistency, and that's something the Deputy Dean spoke about, which we are doing as well through our program improvement process. So it's bringing the staff together and looking at all the different ways that programs are administered to look at, is there a more consistent way applied across the programs where we can look at key performance indicators, or, you know, are the programs meeting the goals and objectives? But I want to emphasize that is the current practice, so that when we provide a grant funding grant to a community group or to a business within a sector, they specifically have to demonstrate in their final reports how the project meets the stated objectives and goals of that grant program. I can maybe I'll hand it over to Chris, who can talk a little bit about one, and then maybe Bill as well, just to give you an example of what I'm talking about.
Mr. Shore?
Thanks, Deputy. So very similar to what Deputy Gatien referred to in terms of logic models, we use logic models as well at CCTH for our programs. So for example, in my division, which is the development of culture and heritage, we have a program called the Creative Industries Fund, which is specifically geared at support for what we call creative industries, publishing, music, film, that type of thing. And we have a very specific logic model that's in place, that's looking looking at key performance indicators. So that program looks to build capacity within those businesses, it looks to build export capability, and it looks to build innovation. So those are very clearly stated objectives at the beginning when someone is applying to that. That's very, very clear to them. And the project that they might bring forward is evaluated against those indicators. How are they going to address those things? If the project's successful, then they go off and they do their activity, and they come back and they give us a final report addressing those specific pieces. So we can look at, for example, if we're looking at innovation, we would be looking at, well, is this project new? What type of new activity are you undertaking? What are you experimenting with? In terms of export, it's driven by sales, it's driven by the number of people that you've hired, and all of those indicators are part of how we measure their success in any given program. So that kind of logic model, which is sort of the input, the activity, the output, and the outcome, is a framework that we use for every grant program that we run.
Mr. Greenlaw?
I just to reiterate what everybody else has said, it's really, if you think about it, it's an iterative or fluid process. So if you look at our program applications, the goals and objectives are clearly outlined, and applicants or proponents need to explain how they're going to meet the goals and objectives of the program in their funding application, and then they're scored against that. So by the end of the project, the evaluation, don't want to be too simplistic about it, but so if you take a recreation facility development grant, if somebody needed a new roof, how does the new roof meet the goals and objectives of Recreation for All? The evaluation at the end of it is, did the new roof get on? Is it there? And we go and assess that to make sure it was done, and is it being used? So, so that's the simplistic form of a grant program, but it's really the detail, and the devil is in the front end of setting up what we're looking for in order to meet the goals and objectives of the government of the day.
Mr. Tilley.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for those answers. I appreciate it. Just a couple of minutes left, so wanted to chat a little bit about risk assessment. So I think somebody, I forget who it was, mentioned that we're now embedding risk assessment criteria into the grant policies. So I'm just wondering if we could elaborate a little bit on that and explain that process.
Deputy Dean?
Well, I can start by saying that, having a risk assessment as part of the evaluation framework or part of the program design up front was critical. It was a critical element in improving the program administration. So really it's about looking at, the size of the grant, the level of criteria, the eligibility criteria, and having that reflect, the nature of what you're trying to do. So, for example, if it is a very large grant, there may be a more rigorous eligibility process up front, more due diligence that needs to be done before a grant's provided. If it's a very small grant, you wouldn't do the same level of due diligence. So as you're designing it up front, you have to do a risk assessment around that. So basically, most of the departments would be doing that. What we're going to do is put in place the best practice, which would be to do a risk assessment, and suggest that all departments who are designing new programs would look at that up front. Rob, is there anything that you wanted to add to that in terms of an overarching principle?
No?
Yeah.
Okay. Mr. Tilley?
So from a departmental perspective, with regards to awarding of grants and then follow-up of grants, what's the current process that we follow? Just as an example of, the assessing the risk from award to completion, I guess, just briefly. I know it's a pretty broad question, but.
Deputy Dean?
I don't think I could speak to a specific departmental process.
Deputy Gatien?
Sure, I can speak to what we do. So following this audit, the department actually developed an enterprise risk assessment risk management policy. And so we ran, as I mentioned, we ran all our natural resources grants through that to sort of see, are they meeting the threshold for risk, the mitigations perhaps that are needed. So I'm trying to go quickly because I know time's running short for you. So that whole process has happened for the grant programs. And then as we are issuing grants to organizations, we're just sort of laying out the performance indicators, the requirements, keeping the that risk management process that we've already followed for the grant program to make sure what we're asking this organization to do aligns with what we've said they need to do in terms of risk. And then as they report back and monitor, we will then review the results of the grants that they've dispersed or the work that they've done using the grant funding to make sure it all aligns with what we've set out for them in terms of our expectations and the evaluation aligns. But we wouldn't necessarily do a full risk analysis every year because we've done it for the program. But as part of the continuous improvement, of course, we'd certainly be prepared to revisit it if we felt that the evaluations coming in were not meeting what we were requiring. I hope that's clear.
Mr. Tilley, you have 20 seconds.
All right, thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you all for those answers. I really appreciate it, and I can say the grant process and it helps a lot of organizations, and I'm really happy to hear that stakeholders are involved in that process. So, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Tilley. We will now move on to questioning by the NDP Caucus. You have until 9:51, and we will begin first with Ms. LeBlanc.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you all for being here. I just wanted to start with a question to Deputy Minister Dean about this new sort of overarching, policy, grant policy across departments. I'm wondering if it asks departments to consider whether operational funding would achieve objectives versus program funding, and this is like across departments, just as sort of a general question. And does it? A second question, B part is, does it require programs to consider equity or living wages?
Deputy Dean.
Thank you for the question. I guess what I would say is the policy is designed to be broad enough that it provides some core elements that everybody needs to consider in the different phases, and the specifics would be program specific. So, I think an equity lens is across all of government, so departments developing programming would apply that lens. When you talk, I'm sorry, your first question was about operational funding versus program funding, I think?
Yes.
Yeah, and I harken back to my days at CCH when I think about that, and perhaps you want to comment on that further. There are situations, absolutely, where the type of support that's required for an organization may be better suited to operational versus project or project specific through a different program. So I think as departments design programming, they have to assess the needs of the client they're supporting to determine the best way to deliver that funding, but that would be their decision. So the guidelines are more about kind of best practices and things that you should take into consideration in your design, in your implementation, in your evaluation. But it's the departments that are responsible for actually designing to the client need, for monitoring, for the accountability of their funding for their programs. So hopefully that addresses it.
Ms. LeBlanc?
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to ask more questions about this later too, Deputy Huston. But so it's not necessarily a best practice then to like when designing programs, it's not necessarily a best practice to have a focus on like individual grant programs versus operational funding, for instance, for an organization.
Deputy Dean?
I would suggest that it isn't that prescriptive. So what we were trying to do with the policy is give space for departments to design based on the unique needs of their clients. So we weren't as prescriptive as that.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Ms. LeBlanc?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to ask a few questions about the grant review process that's happening at CCTH. First of all, first question is when will it be complete?
Deputy Huston?
Yeah, thanks. We should be wrapping up, and Chris, correct me if I'm wrong, but it should be towards the end of this calendar year, correct? Yeah. So I would say by December. I could be a little bit off by a couple months depending on timing of things, but that's the target.
Ms. LeBlanc?
Great. And my understanding is that this is sort of a process that hasn't happened in a long time, so it's happening now. Is there an idea to continue it on a regular basis, like every 5 years or every 3 years or something like that now?
Deputy Huston?
Yes, built into the process will be regular check-ins going forward, building on the work that we were able to do and the structures we were able to set up across the department and with the different sector organizations. And the idea will be to revisit that and to see if particularly if we're going to be making some changes that are being desired by sectors, and are they effective and are they reaching the goals and objectives that we're trying for? So we're going to need to go back and look at are they effective?
Ms. LeBlanc?
So in CCTH particularly, does the review include an evaluation of operating monies versus program monies and that kind of thing? Yeah.
Deputy Huston?
Yeah, certainly that's an aspect of it for sure. So it's looking at the various different programs and what they're focused on, but it isn't necessarily looking at operating versus program or project. So it's looking at the full piece. So there's like I mentioned, there's over 77 different grant programs. Within that 77, about 44 are application-based. So public-facing, once or twice a year, people can apply into that. There are 3 very large buckets of operating funding, so focused on arts and culture, sport and recreation, and then museums, libraries, archives. And so across that broad spectrum, we're looking at all those different programs and how they apply. Within, say, the bucket for arts and culture organization core funding, we're looking within those and drilling down into that as well.
Ms. LeBlanc?
Thanks. And at CCTH, when a big project gets presented, so I'm thinking of like the Canoe 22 championships, or the soundstage in film and television, or the World Juniors, whatever, is it the Women's World Juniors coming in, or just the men's? It's okay. At Christmas time. How does that figure in? So is there do you have a giant pot of money that's like special projects, and then that just gets doled out as organizations come and look for funding, or or we're putting bids in or whatever, or does it come from a totally separate area of the provincial budget? Are there pockets that come from individual departments? I guess this is for any department, in fact. Just how does it work?
Deputy Gatien?
We don't have any discretionary funds in natural resources and renewables. If something were to happen like that, it would actually take government saying, here's an allocation of funding, and this is what we want you to use it for.
Deputy Huston?
So in answer to it's a little bit of both. So here's how it works, and I'll do my best to explain it, and then I'm going to hand it over to Chris, who knows a little bit more than I do. So there are funds earmarked, for example, in Strategic Fund Initiative or Advance Nova Scotia, where we start the budget year, where we have funds that are allocated, which we think is an envelope that should towards projects we anticipate that are coming in the fiscal year that we see on the horizon. But of course, opportunities arise. The World Juniors is a great example where it couldn't be held in Russia, and the opportunity to host it here in Canada, and Nova Scotia was a winning bid along with New Brunswick. And so that requires us to go to Treasury and Policy Board to request additional funds to be applied into that existing funding structure. And so I'll let Chris explain a little bit more detail. So it's kind of a yes to answer your question, a little bit of both.
Mr. Shore.
Thanks. Yep. So for example, the two that you use. So the Events Nova Scotia is a unit that's in my division in the department, and they follow the Nova Scotia Events Strategy, which was laid out a number of years ago, which kind of sets the process for how we deal with those, both the attraction and execution of those large-scale events. So in certain cases, there's a budget. There's a budget that's associated with that, and I would say we have an idea of what's coming in a given year, and those organizers would come to us and say, hey, I want to hold this event, and so we would allocate budget that way. When there are larger ones, like the World Juniors, that come within a given year, just as the deputy mentioned, the event strategy, which was passed under the previous government, basically directs us to go into Treasury Board and say, hey, for these large-scale events like Canoe 22, like World Juniors, like the North American Indigenous Games, we go into Treasury Board and say, hey, we have this opportunity, here's the amount of money we need, here are the funding partners, so we develop that type of ask. So it's kind of based on, as the deputy said, it's based on those two elements. One, which is the smaller type of events which we can identify and come to us, and we have a schedule of that looking out for a couple of years. And then the big ones, which we don't have a budget for, but we specifically go into Treasury Board for specific asks.
Ms. LeBlanc, you have just over 10 minutes.
Thank you. Thanks. Great, that's helpful. I would just want to dig down for a second into CCTH and talk about, of course, as you know, it's no secret that, I come from the culture side of things and have written many a grant application in my life to this province. So I just want to know, now that I've been out of it for a while, okay, and maybe this is particularly for the arts sector, not even the cultural industries, but when those grant applications are being considered, is there a scoring or a higher scoring if there are living wages being paid to artists or the people involved? Is that something you're looking at? Are you looking at whether or not there's an equity lens, and that can be, a larger definition of equity, but underserved populations, employed artists, that kind of thing. So I'm wondering if that is part of the scoring. And I have another question, but I'll just leave that.
Deputy Huston?
Yeah, so in answer to your question around living wages, the answer is no. We don't look at that as a screening criteria around when we're looking in at an applicant's in terms of what wages are paid. It's a bigger kind of project around, a staffing, but we don't go down into those details there. We do have an EDI lens on almost every program, all programs, but they're applied sometimes a little bit differently, and that relates to, as you'd be familiar, within different grant programs, there may be different judging processes or criteria. So we think of Arts Nova Scotia, where they have an independent panel that would award and provide grants to individual artists. And then we have others that might be done through internal screening by the department and staff, which look at it. And so yes, we do absolutely look at the EDI, but in answer to your living wages question, the answer is no.
Ms. LeBlanc?
Okay, and then another question is, Deputy Minister Dean was talking about risk assessment and sort of in this larger, whatever it's called, what's it called? Grant policy? What is it called? Grants management framework. And in that, there's risk assessment, obviously, which is very important. However, in arts and culture, it's so much harder to figure out what the risk is, or what the success is, right? Like what the key performance indicators are. Like, did you get 50 people at your play, or did 100 people walk through the art gallery? And if they did they pay attention? Like, how do you even figure that out? So how, do you, Deputy Minister Huston, have to go to Treasury Board and say it's a different situation, we need different types of KPIs or different types of risk assessment, or the risk is different? How does that all work in the larger sort of understanding of how we spend money in the province?
Deputy Huston.
Yeah, so I can speak to that. So I have the benefit of having a colleague as the Deputy Minister of Finance who was formerly the Deputy Minister at Communities, Culture and Heritage. So she gets it. And we're able to have those conversations, which is why I emphasize in my opening remarks is we know because of the sectors we work with and the communities we serve, this can't be a one-size-fits-all approach. It needs to be geared towards the people that we work with and the unique situation. So, for example, we've got 25 million this past year, $41 million film fund. We can't expect the same kind of rigor or risk assessment for a $500 community art fund. It's a different scale, and it would be unfair to ask, and this is part of the work that we've been doing with the program improvement, it's unfair to ask a community group, which is all volunteers in some way, the same kind of level of rigor and requirements of reporting on a $25 million grant as we do with a $500, which is not what we do, and we don't want to see that happen. So we certainly, and the other thing I would just say is that we do rely on the folks that we work with, whether it's peer councils, such as Arts Nova Scotia, or it's our staff who typically come from industry, to help provide that guidance in terms of what is relevant and reasonable risk assessment for these projects, and whether it's a successful project or not.
Ms. LeBlanc, you have just under 6 minutes.
Plenty of time. Well, lest you think that I only care about arts and culture, which is absolutely not true, I have a question for natural resources and renewables. So in your opening remarks, you mentioned that, or I just wanted to clarify this, did you say that you have completed all of the auditor, like the follow-up recommendations?
Deputy Gatien.
Yes, for the 3 programs. In fact, we've also done the additional 6 that were natural resources. We've not completed the energy and mines. That's begun, though.
Great.
Ms. LeBlanc?
Thank you. So the Auditor General explained in the report, the 2018 report, that between administration fees and funding provided, Forest Nova Scotia collects the equivalent of about 25% of the total grant funding. Has the department done any review to determine what is an appropriate amount to be spending on administration? And has the ratio changed since 2018? And in fact, this is a question directed at natural resources and renewables, but in fact, I'd be interested to hear if CCTH is also kind of considering that, like administration versus program, even though they're kind of intertwined.
Deputy Gatien.
The administration fee right now is 10%. Yes, 10%, yeah.
Deputy Gatien?
To my earlier point, it's, as we move through these grant programs, it's something that we will have to continuously look at. 10% for Forest Nova Scotia, I should say, because we haven't completed the energy and mines. I will have to look at those.
Okay.
Deputy Huston?
Yeah, I was just conferring with my colleagues here. So just sense of, they were just mentioning to me that we're at around 20% of the budgets are allocated can be allocated towards administrative. That's where the average is across all the different programs, which is pretty good relative to some other administrative. If you look at some other major institutions, it's close to 40 at some point.
Deputy Dean, do you have anything further to add to that?
I'm actually thinking that this is a very good question. And as we look at the policy, wondering what type of guidelines perhaps we could provide to departments around acceptable size of an administration fee, recognizing that there could be differences, again, depending on whether it's an operational program, right, or, something project specific. So just thank you for the question.
Ms. LeBlanc.
Thank you. I want to ask about the soundstage in the film world. So that was announced, I forget when, but I believe there was money allocated in the budget in the spring. Correct me if I'm wrong. Maybe I'm not. Maybe I'm, okay. Anyway, can you talk a little bit about where that is at and who is administering that money? I understand that Screen Nova Scotia is sort of the caretaker of the money, but anyway, can you just explain a little bit about where that is, how's it going, what's going on?
Mr. Shore.
Thanks for the question. So the money was allocated in the last fiscal year, at the end of the last fiscal year, and identified for the development of a soundstage. It was allocated directly to Screen Nova Scotia, so they are the caretakers of that money. The money went to them directly. In that period, so we work very closely with them on the development of that project, and they have to, so as part of them receiving the money, there's a terms and conditions document where they have to keep us updated and keep us informed throughout the process of the work that's going towards the building of that soundstage. So we get regular reports from them, as are required, that would include all of their activities and if any money has been spent to date on that. Right now, as of today, they have gone through a process where they've hired a project manager who actually is an expert in that particular kind of a build. It's a substantial kind of, very specific kind of build that they're looking for. They've identified and actually traveled to a number of different sound stages across Canada and toured those and are beginning to kind of scope out exactly what they need specifically for the film industry here in Nova Scotia. So they've had some very, very successful meetings in the last month or so, I would say, and are moving along with all of the work that they have to do in order to set the groundwork for a successful project there. So it's underway, work is underway and going very well.
Ms. LeBlanc, you have 40 seconds.
Great. So would you say then that you feel very comfortable? When the money was allocated to Screen Nova Scotia, which I have a lot of respect for the organization, but I thought it was a strange choice just to dump like millions and millions of dollars for a project that hasn't, didn't have a framework yet. So would you say that you're feeling really comfortable given these regular updates? Because it seems like you are right on top of what's happening. You're feeling good about all that?
Mr. Shore?
Yeah, so the project itself was based on a feasibility study that was done before. So before any money was allocated, there was a feasibility study that was completed by Nordicity that identified what the needs were in Nova Scotia. So it's based on some work that had already been done for a couple of years.
Thank you. The time for the NDP questioning has elapsed. We'll now move on to the PC caucus with, you have until 10:11. Mr. Boudreau.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for coming today. And it's good to hear that on these follow-ups of the 2018 recommendations, some are completed, some are scheduled to be completed this year. So that's encouraging. Our caucus, we all have questions today, so I'm going to be pretty brief with my questioning today. But I'm going to tailor my question to Deputy Minister Huston a little bit. The province, and you've talked about it, the province offers a whole bunch of different grants in your sector, and our organizations and our communities are obviously reaching out to us, applying for grants. But to make sure that we're reaching those that could benefit from this type of funding, how do we typically promote our grants, and what kind of reminders does the department do for grant deadlines, for example?
Deputy Huston?
Thanks for the question. I'll start with that, and then I'll hand it to my colleagues here who can give it some specific examples. So, it's really important. We really pride ourselves, as I mentioned earlier, in having a really close ear to the ground and directly working with the communities in the sectors that we serve. That was really evident during COVID, and I think we are very supportive and responsive of those communities and sectors. So it's a multitude of ways. So there may be, emails sent out to listservs. There will be community meetings where things are communicated directly to communities at known events. There will be scheduled times where we will meet with certain sectors across, say, a range of, say, canoe and paddle clubs, where they will be debriefed on what's available in the upcoming year. So there's a range of opportunities, but clearly some of the most important part around both making the clear awareness of what exists, but also I think it's really important relative to some of the recommendations from the OAG is helping communities and groups understand what the program objectives and goals actually are. And I think one of the key, the most critical parts actually of the whole risk management process is that upfront work with organizations to understand what it is they're applying for and why. And it's not uncommon for a group to come in door A, to work with our staff that may be over here and say, actually, who you need to work with that's better suited is to come in door B over here, and I'm going to put you in touch with this person, or we're going to set up a meeting with you directly. What we don't like to see in our department, let alone across government, but particularly in a department, is the passing of the ball. Like, no, we don't know who, doesn't work for this fund, sorry. Like, that's not an acceptable answer in our department. It's always, okay, we're interesting. Tell us more about what you're trying to achieve. That might not work here, but we want to see how it works here. Maybe, Bill, I hand it over to you to see if you have any examples.
Mr. Greenlaw?
Sure. Well, I'm just going to wait for the mic. Thanks.
That's all.
It's part of that veteran stuff, waiting for the light. I like your opening remarks, Madam Chair, about wax. What did you say about pontificating or something along those lines? I'll try not to do that too much. But we also, just to add on to what Deputy Huston has said, we also do emails to your constituency office about our grant programs, so your constituency offices are aware of those as well. In addition, particularly my division, and they're used across our department, but we have regional managers who have relationships with community members and keep them informed of our grants that are going out as a reminder. But in addition to that, and over the last 5 years, we've made intentional efforts to reach out to marginalized or disadvantaged communities to make them aware of our grant programs, et cetera. Now that's more complex because there's an element of trust in reaching out to those that haven't really accessed government funding before. So it's also building that trusting relationship that we need to focus on as well. So, and that is we're still working on that and still building those relationships of trust. And as the deputy said, we really think about the art of the possible. So if a grant comes in and we look at it and we go, well, that's really not for that program, but we really think it's a good fit over here, we'll move the file over so it has a better chance of being funded. So we work with the clients and pinpoint those needs. One specific example I'll give you is that we have the business accessibility grants are in my division. And so we did a call. The first call was before the fiscal year, did a call for business and community accessibility. Community accessibility totally oversubscribed. So I would say that by the nature of the applications to our grant programs, people are aware of it, but I'm not saying that all Nova Scotians are aware of it. So I want to preface that. And we do make efforts, as I said earlier, to do that. But the business accessibility, there was still some funding left in it, and we went out and we looked at where the applications weren't coming from, what area of the province, and we did a specific media campaign in that region to try to get more interest in the business accessibility grants, and we were successful in doing that. So on top of everything else, if we notice that, and the business accessibility grants is a relatively new grant program for our department and for government, so I think this is the last time that we'll have to do that extra media, use the media to promote our grants. But that would be an example of we've had it come in, we look, we see there's a gap. We know that business accessibility or accessibility grants are very important to Nova Scotians, and we went out and made the extra effort and, quite frankly, spent a little bit more money on advertising, which we try to avoid, but to do a media call. And so I think that's a good example of the full spectrum of how we try to promote our grants.
Mr. Boudreau?
Yeah.
14 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I would say, my constituency office, like everybody else's, I think appreciates those kind of heads up. And we try to target and reach out to community groups and organizations once we get those to kind of make sure they're aware of what's out there that could help them. But one of the questions I often get, and sometimes I'm able to answer, sometimes I'm able to not, is like, what time of the year are most grants open? So we have some grants that have specific timelines, some grants that aren't. When are they open? When are they closed? And I know you've got 77, I think I saw that I heard earlier. But like, do you typically have timelines for these types of grants?
Mr. Greenlaw.
Sure. Thank you for the question. The application deadlines are public, so we have a brochure where they're public, but just as a general rule, which a lot of your constituents are interested in, particularly other than, well, I would say our capital infrastructure grants. So we open the call early December with a closing in mid-November or mid-February of that year, so we can do our due diligence and do the life cycle award, look at what people are applying for, scored, et cetera. So when the budget is passed, we're ready to go out the door in April or May, depending on when the budget's passed, to award the capital grants so people can start during the work during the building season. So that is one example. And then there are some grant deadlines which are, again, public. There's 2 calls a year or 3 calls a year, depending. And then there's the there's a proposal base, which are generally open for the year. So this is kind of a broad thing. I don't know all the 77. I can speak for the capital grant because I get asked that one, the most common question. But the rest, I would have to, like you, look at our brochure, right? So, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Boudreau?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just one more question. And so this is, if I was a community group, how would I go about getting funding from your department, right? So you talk about there's applications for that capital grant, and there's a, from November to February. But what about things that aren't in that? Like, how does a community group go about applying?
Mr. Huston, Deputy Huston.
So thank you. Similar to my previous answer as well, there's a range of different options, which is important because not every community group is going to want to understand or access government in the same way. So, for example, it may be through one of, say, like Acadian Affairs and Contacts or African Nova Scotian Affairs in one of our new regional offices, someone coming in the door and saying, I've got a great project in my community, how do I make this happen? And having those staff connect with the relevant folks internally. And again, the answer, we don't want to be, I don't know, go call somebody in the department. We want to, it's sort of concierge service, get them to the right people at the right time. The other thing, as we've mentioned, I think, thank Bill for bringing it up, is going into constituency offices is absolutely key. And we really pride ourselves in working with all MLAs. So it's not uncommon, I'll get a call, 2 or 3 calls a week from constituency offices saying, hey, I've got somebody who's got a great idea and it's anywhere in the province. Is there something that's applicable? And 9 times out of 10, yes, there is. And here's who we can have them talk to. So it's really around meeting people where they're at, not forcing them to come into government in a way that only works for us. We know that that doesn't work. So it's really about creating lots of opportunities.
Mr. Boudreau.
Thank you for the answer to that question. I'm going to finish up with my time, and I'll pass it over, I think, to my colleague, MLA Young.
Mr. Young, you have 10 minutes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. My question is going to be around the Rink Revitalization Fund. So the Rink Revitalization Fund is a new grant. It was created under our government to support the sustainability of the facilities. And so far, it's my understanding that this fund has provided over $2 million in funding. So in 2018, the AG recommended that the department establish performance indicators, measure performance, and regularly evaluate grants programs. Has the department done this for the Rink Revitalization Fund?
Deputy Huston.
The short answer to that is yes, we have. And we'll take the opportunity, it's a new fund that was established through our Recreation Facility Development Fund as a way to kind of quickly be able to move the money out the door because we knew that the demand would be so great. And sure enough, within the first year, I think we were oversubscribed. In the second year as well, we finished. So this is something I'll let Bill talk about in a little bit more detail, but it is a pretty black and white one in the sense that they're looking for, there's criteria in terms of who can apply, like nonprofits, municipalities, First Nations. But it's around a capital investment of some kind in terms of improving the facility to make the rinks more accessible and available to community for more community use. So at the end of the day, in terms of looking at whether outcomes were met, it's pretty clear to look at, is there more availability for community? Are washrooms now accessible so that more folks can enjoy the rink? So the short answer is yes, and I'll let Bill, I don't know if you want to expand on that at all.
Mr. Greenlaw.
Well, that was a really good answer. I'm not sure I can expand on it, Deputy. Performance reviews are coming in, so I'm just joking. So I would say it's much like we described. It's the life cycle of the grant. So it's part of our RFD. It has been extremely a popular, oversubscribed grant for the first 2 calls, and then again for the next year, the rink revitalization call will go out in December for a February close. I've for those of you who have children or have spent time in either curling rinks or arenas for skating, etc., I've learned more about ice chillers and ice plants on these grant applications as I was intrigued to see what people would apply for. So it's right from chillers to bathrooms to roofs to clocks, scoring clocks. And again, the goals and objectives are right in the upfront in the application. There's an assessment done. We do a risk assessment. Can they actually spend the money? Are their estimates accurate for what they want to do? And then we progress to the awarding of the grant, and then there's follow-up by regional staff to make sure that what they said they were going to do is actually completed. So,
thank you, Mr. Greenlaw. Mr. Young.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up with that. So how do you determine which applicants receive funding and how much funding they'll receive?
Deputy Huston.
Thanks for that. So similar to other grant programs, there'll be criteria that are established. And in the case of this program, we look at things like community benefit and impact, needs assessment, project planning, equity, accessibility, safety and inclusion, and the viability, sustainability of the project. And these are graded and scored on a percentage basis. And so, when projects come in, we'll look at and score that. Now, what's important to also note too, and again, we really pride ourselves on the art of the possible. If our staff are looking at an application, and again, as we know, some of these rinks are run by community volunteers that have day jobs and they're busy doing other work. And if we see that there's, they may just be missing some information and staff know, well, this project is about more accessible bathrooms, so clearly they just didn't maybe articulate clearly in their proposal, clearly that this would help raise their score. Staff will go back and talk with folks and say, can we understand this project a little bit more? Because this isn't about finding ways to say no to community projects. This is about helping folks to be able to articulate why this project is important to their community and why government should. And so that's how we operate.
Mr. Young?
Yeah, thank you for your answers, and thank you for the hard work that you put into this, too. I'll pass it off to my colleague, MLA Sheehy-Richard.
Ms. Sheehy-Richard.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Coming back fresh from a conference on public accounts, it's exciting to hear that you guys are listening to some of the recommendations and making those changes so that the public funding money is protected and spent and reaches the most amount of people that it possibly can in organizations. So thank you for your hard work. That was something that we learned, was to give credit where it is due, and thank you for that. I want to touch a little bit on tourism, because we all know that growing tourism to ensure that all the regions of this beautiful province benefit from revenue growth is very important. Can you tell me a little bit more about what programs and services we are offering to achieve this goal?
Deputy Huston.
Thank you for the question. It's a great opportunity to talk about the work of tourism. As you know, tourism came into communities' culture and heritage this previous year, and it's been exciting to work with them and look at the synergies between the work that we do, whether it's in the film industry or with museums and libraries or out in the region. And they've got a lot of experience working in target markets to look at bringing people to Nova Scotia, and there's some real opportunity to look at regional tourism assets. And so they're working with the tourism industry of Nova Scotia and other direct marketing organizations, as well as directly with tour operators, to develop essentially what they're calling Compelling Tourism Communities Initiative. And so it's a suite of different programs that are going to be available to different regional operators or regional organizations. So for example, working with communities to do community assessments and understanding what their tourism assets are and where their strengths are and where they can build upon those. Looking at the work they do already within visitor research. So the Tourism Nova Scotia team does an excellent job looking at key markets such as Quebec, Ontario, Northeast US, parts of Europe, and working with those markets to understand what resonates best. What do people, from Toronto that are coming to visit Nova Scotia, what are they looking to experience? And then translating that down to the regional level. So working with local organizations to understand what the travelers' interests are and needs are, and helping gear those assets to to that desire, that need. Looking as well at marketing campaigns and content, so working with regions on a consistent branding approach that can tie into the corporate provincial approach, and so that it looks seamless in terms of if you're looking whether it's somewhere in Richmond County or that it can tie in. It's like, okay, that's the Nova Scotia brand. The other part is that we're doing some work around digital adoption. So if anybody is, we've all traveled, we're all tourism experts, but the way now is not, you typically don't go to CAA and get your TripAdvisor thing anyway. You're going online. And essentially, if you don't exist online in the tourism world, you don't exist. And it's a real effort to help operators have a digital presence and a presence that captures people and say, I want to go there, I want to stay there, I want to experience that. So that's an example of some of the work that tourism is already doing right now and will be really rolling out over the next year. This time of year is not the best time of year to launch. People are busy actually operating and focused on serving the visitors that are here now. It's typically as we move into the winter is when these programs will really get underway in preparation for next year.
Ms. Sheehy Richard.
That's really good. My colleague even said, oh, good, that because, it's evident even in my community and anywhere in the province that you guys are doing a pretty good job at it, because the tourism, I noticed this summer in particular, has just been phenomenal. And, there's car shortage, rentals, and all kinds of those problems that are kind of good problems to have when you're trying to rebuild the economy. So when we start to move into this last quarter of 2022, I'm wondering if you can share with us some of the grant programs that local tourism operators were able to take advantage of this past year.
Deputy Huston, you have 45 seconds.
Okay, well, I think I want to highlight then the digital aspect. So we're working with them on digital content marketing program, which is helping them acquire images. They co-invest along with the province to acquire high resolution digital photography and videos that they can be used online. And as well, we're working with them on upping their digital game, so looking at online sales, opportunities to streamline their process and move digital, which is what consumers are looking for these days.
Well, we finished a little early there. Okay, so the time has elapsed for the PC questioning. We will, and that was the first round of our questioning. We will now move into a second round. Each caucus will have 11 minutes, beginning first with the Liberal caucus. Mr. Tilley.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question at this point, I want to focus a little bit on the impact that inflation has had on the grant process. So we all know we're at a 40-year high in inflation, and I think this would apply, mostly to the capital type grants, but others as well. So how has this changed the implementation or the uptake on the grant process?
Deputy Huston.
Yeah, that's great. It's a great question. It's very relevant, and it's a very important question right now. So let's focus on the capital a little bit, and we can talk a little bit about operating either now or perhaps later as well. So when it comes to the capital, we're certainly seeing there's been some changes in year. So there are organizations that may have received funding for capital projects prior to some of this inflation, and we're in constant conversation with them around ways that in some cases the project may need to be scaled back. In other cases, if a compelling case can be made and there's a real need and a demonstrated need, we can look at going back to Treasury and Policy Board and seek additional funds, which has happened in some cases. But some of the COVID, what we're calling COVID escalation costs and capital, and you would have seen this in probably some other public accounts presentations, is real. But there is a difference, I think, what we're seeing between some of what the actual real costs are and then some of the perception and some of the challenges around, frankly, some of the chaos that's right now within the construction sector around labor shortages, access to resources, and that is requiring us to, in some cases, a pause on some developments and give it time to cool down so that we can understand what the real costs are going forward. But I think, going into this next funding cycle is when we're really going to see some of the differences. And I think it's too early to basically say what it's going to look like going in next year, but we know costs are going to increase.
Mr. Tilley?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for that answer. And when we're looking at our performance improvement process or in redesigning new grants, are we looking at a standardized process for an organization who's received a grant to come back with a process to say, you know what, the costs have exceeded our expectations, we're halfway through implementation? Is there a standard way that they can then access more funds?
Deputy Huston.
Yeah, that is certainly something that we're looking at, and it's a best practice that we do in almost all cases, but in those, we're looking to make sure that that happens as part of the process. So what no one wants is a surprise at the 11th hour, at the end of a project or close to a deadline, and it's a surprise to everybody that, costs have risen by a third, and now we need additional dollars to finish this project, otherwise it's stranded. So built in, inherent to all these processes, and Chris mentioned this in one of the projects, there are check-ins throughout that are either, depending on, and again, this comes back to the risk assessment, frankly, is if it's a major project or we're talking big dollars, there are more formal, regular check-ins so that there aren't big surprises. If it's a relatively small grant and smaller, then we're not as focused on it. But that said, I mentioned our staff work very closely with organizations and communities, and it's very rare that we're surprised by a project. We usually can see there's something coming, and the folks will come in early and ask us, hey, we need to sit down and talk. And like I said, sometimes it's, okay, where are you at in this project? We're going to need to look at maybe scaling back or doing this thing differently, or can other partners come on board to help defray the cost? Or is this something that we need to, because it is such an important community asset, is this something that we need to look at and go back and request government of additional dollars?
Mr. Tilley.
Thank you, Madam Chair. With regards to the operational side and even some of the smaller grants, are there any plans in this fiscal to look at increasing those grants by the levels of inflation, or some way for those organizations to spread those dollars a little further?
Deputy Huston.
Well, we're certainly limited within this fiscal since budgets have been allocated, and we don't have the ability to go back on many of these. But we do constantly look at what we would refer to as slippage throughout the year. So there may be projects that, for a variety of reasons, can't get off the ground, and the government may then be able to reallocate some of those fundings for particular organizations that are in need. I think COVID illustrated that very clearly. Is that not all organizations should be treated equally, in the sense that they all are coming from different places, different backgrounds, in terms of the nature of the work that they do and the sectors that they serve. So, for example, in COVID, performing arts organizations that need to have a live audience are not the same as organizations that deal with things, say, remotely. And so looking at ways that we can respond to the needs on the ground, understanding there's always a level of fairness and accountability and transparency, but being realistic about who needs support and when.
Mr. Tilley, you have just over 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And so just thinking about budgeting and the cost of inflation, we don't see that coming down anytime soon. Are there any plans in place for next year's budget to make recommendations to the government to increase the funding for grants?
Deputy Huston.
Again, yes, but I think it isn't across the board. We're looking, obviously, and the sectors that are feeling it the most have been very vocal, meeting with our minister, and have been very clear around some of the pressures and the challenges that they're facing, and have recommended to us that we do look at additional funding for operating and to help defray some of those existing costs that they're feeling already, let alone some of the incoming inflation. But again, I just want to emphasize that, across 77 programs, that some organizations are feeling and they're in a good spot and have had increases to operating, or because of the revenue they're able to generate, are in a good place, and other organizations are having a more difficult time.
Mr. Tilley?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I guess just sticking on the idea of the cost of living, and when we're developing our improvement or our performance indicators. So when we think about the impact that some of these grants can have on community members, will we be looking at certain ways that through the implementation of these grants that we can improve our organizations in their delivery of the programs so that, you know, maybe there'll be some slippage to apply to other organizations?
Deputy Huston.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yeah, absolutely. That's a part of the kind of the work that we do with the organizations is to make sure that they are running as effectively and as efficiently as they can by helping provide some of those supports, and whether it's administrative or it's others around board governance and capacity. But I want to take the opportunity to say that these organizations are operating as lean and as mean as they can. And like I mentioned earlier, a lot of these organizations and community groups are run by volunteers in community or maybe have summer students in. And so where we look at in terms of slippage is not to sort of see if we can scale back funding to organizations, but it comes where it comes naturally around, like I said, there might have been a great project planned, but for whatever reason, construction didn't line up in time before the winter. It gets cold and they can't break ground. Well, there's more funds available. Let's look at ways that we can reallocate that within that sector or that community that it was targeted. So we're not talking about always moving money from, you know, an arts and culture organization to sport and rec. It's looking within that sector, how can we use those funds differently?
Mr. Tilley.
How much time do I have?
You have until 22.
22. Okay, good. Well, I know from my perspective, in my community, one of the organizations has received a grant under the Rink Revitalization program, and it's been very beneficial. Are there plans to expand that program into the next fiscal as well?
Deputy Huston?
Yeah, so the Rink Revitalization Fund will continue. It won't expand in terms of the envelope, so we'll remain at $1 million, but it will continue.
Mr. Tilley.
That's excellent, because I know, as you mentioned, a lot of the small rinks in our communities, and in my community I have 2 that are run by volunteer boards, and the cost of inflation has really set them back. So for example, the Amera Centre in North Sydney, once they begin to put their ice in September, their power bill alone will be $22,000 a month. And they're struggling to maintain their ability to be operational. So, are there any plans, future plans, to look at more on the operational side for those community organizations?
Deputy Huston.
When it comes to the rinks, directly, no. We're more focused on the capital investments. But I can say that one of the things we look to do is, 2 birds with 1 stone. So, for example, if we can look at ways around energy conservation, you speak specifically of the power bills. If we can look at ways of greening facilities up front or retrofitting, it's sort of a win-win, because it's an ability to have a smaller greenhouse gas footprint, but also reduce costs to community groups that have less, bake sales they've got to run or fees they have to charge for folks, which then makes it more challenging for more folks to go out and actually be active. So we're always trying to look for those win-wins, and so those are probably some of our more favorite projects where we can look at ways to green the building and then reduce costs at the same time.
Order? Oh, nicely done. We will now move on to the NDP questioning. You have 11 minutes. Ms. Coombs.
Thank you, Ms. Chair. My question is for Community Culture, Tourism and Heritage. I'm now trying to get used to CCTH. It's my understanding, that's just coming from a Cape Breton perspective here. So it's my understanding that grants for artists are undersubscribed in Cape Breton. I've heard from musicians that it is difficult for them to receive provincial grants via Music Nova Scotia. And Cape Breton musicians actually are receiving more funding from the CBMIC through a COA. And I'm just wondering if you're able to provide information as to why you think this is, and what can we do to solve it?
Deputy Huston?
Hand it over to my colleague, Chris Shore.
Mr. Shore.
Thanks for the question. So CB Mike, which is the organization that you're referring to, actually receives funding from our department. We give them, and in fact, recently are working with them with an additional allotment because their mandate is focused on the development of artists in Cape Breton. But additionally, we do fund Music Nova Scotia, which does provide money to individual artists across the province as well. So there's a series of programs that artists in Cape Breton can apply to. Additionally, we provide funding to Arts Nova Scotia, which is the Provincial Arts Council, which again allocates money to artists, but it's based not so much on, so Arts Nova Scotia's evaluation is not based necessarily on a region, but it is based on, it's application based and it's peer assessed. So it's based on the applications that are received, although they do have a strategic priority for funding artists that are outside of HRM, and that's a kind of that's something that they're hoping to increase the success rate of.
Ms. Coons?
Yeah. So the thing was the genesis of the question was that Cape Breton artists are undersubscribing to these grants that from the Music Nova Scotia, as well as, I'm glad you mentioned other artists, because that is another issue that I'm hearing of, not just undersubscribing, but not receiving the grants as well through artists of all scopes. And that's why CBRM is looking for a change in the MGA, the Municipal Governments Act, to allow municipalities to be able to provide grants to individuals because of the situation of the undersubscription, as well as the not receiving of the grants when they do subscribe to them.
Deputy Huston?
No, thanks for that question, raising the issue and the concern. So we do, we want to make sure that these grants and these programs are for all Nova Scotians. So, I'll go back and I'll make sure particularly we'll look into the Cape Breton piece, because I want to make sure that there may be the numbers are different just because of per capita or whatever, but we all know Cape Breton's full of amazing artists. So we'll go back and look at that, and we'll get back to you with information specific to that, because it is important. And relative to the CBRM looking at being able to fund artists, that's something that we're working with. We think it's great if any organization or level of government wants to help support arts and culture sectors. We're very supportive of that. So we are working with municipal affairs and folks around trying to enable that as well. So we're very supportive of that, but we'll follow up with you on that.
Ms. Coombs, you have 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, and you actually answered my next question on that, and that was, are you working with municipal affairs on that? Great to hear that. I hope we're going to hear something very soon, particularly fall session would be a great thing to see an amendment to the MGA come. Just putting that out there to everybody. I also want to ask this question, so switching gears a bit. For many years, the operating assistance to artist organizations has stagnated, and any new money has gone into project-based funding programs. Is that based on an analysis or an evaluation by the department that project-based programs are more effective at achieving the department's goals for supporting arts and culture than operating assistance?
Mr. Huston.
Thank you for the question. So let me provide a bit of context, and then I'll answer the question. So we have about $91 million of our departmental budget is allocated towards grants and grant programs, and about half of that, or $41 million, is towards operating. So I just want to set the context that we are providing a considerable amount of operating. That said, we know that operating pressures are real, and they are increasing, as MLA Tilley mentioned, in terms of some of the inflation. So the part of it is that because we have a fixed budget relative to the grant programs we're able to provide, increasing operating creates an ongoing annual pressure that unless we have increases to our budget or we're able to reallocate, in some ways then the project management allows us to be a bit more flexible and nimble around year to year and not committing in operating, which is ongoing pressure. That said, I know and maybe I'll beat you to a follow-up question, I know some of the challenges is that organizations that are already struggling with operating, who are then, essentially it's a project, chasing projects to then help keep their organizations going. We're very live to that, and so that's been a part of, I'm not saying it's the best solution, but part of our program improvement process has been to look at that and look at what kind of, when we do our grant programs, what kind of procedures and programs are we putting in place, and can we do something in 1-page or 2-page report versus a 5-page report to help reduce some of that administrative burden.
Ms. LeBlanc.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Yeah, I just want to follow up on that. First of all, I want to say I know I recognize that you are very alive to that question, and I appreciate and we appreciate that that consideration. And it's true that there are, that there's a substantial amount of the budget that goes to operation. But what you just said is unless there's more money, and so that is the question I want to ask. So we know that the Premier, and I'm taking off my public accounts hat for a second here, folks. We know that the Premier said earlier this year, now is not the time for projects like these, when he was referring to the art gallery. So I just want to know, what is the process, and how is your department going to get more money to put into this kind of funding? Because we all know that it contributes to health and wellness, it contributes to education, it contributes to, art for art's sake. We all know how important CCTH is to our province. How come there can never be any new money for operating?
Deputy Huston.
You guys want to take that one? No.
Perhaps I should have sent that over to Deputy Dean, but she was dealing with arts, so
I don't need to dominate the mic here. Thanks for the question, and I know MLA LeBlanc, you in particular have been a champion of this issue for quite a while. So, the sector in particular, yourself and others, but particularly within the sector, they have been very vocal and have been meeting with the minister on a regular basis and communicating. So the minister understands what the challenges are and the needs are. And, our role as public servants and working in this is to help provide that conduit and flow of information and analysis to help understand what's going on in this sector and where the pressures are and where the opportunities are. And so really it's a matter of bringing things together within our fall budget planning process into the spring, and it's around balancing the variety of pressures and challenges that exist across the system. So, I remain optimistic that we're able to work with the sector as is, but I remain optimistic that we're able to look at other opportunities going forward as well.
Ms. LeBlanc. Back to Ms. Coombs.
Yes, I have one more question. That's around youth, and I know we've discussed operating and we're banging on about it, but youth centers, BGCs, other youth centers, how are you funding them? They are also in need of, operational more than capital. So can you explain how you are working with those underserved communities?
Deputy Huston, you have 30 seconds.
Sure. It's a great question. I wish we had more time to answer this. So, a lot of this is working directly with the community organizations. And, the province plays a key role in that, but we are one of the levels of government. So municipalities, First Nations in other cases, federal government in terms of how we come to the table. And what we always look to in terms of if we can is there's one is the capital build, but we want to ensure that organizations and facilities are sustainable.
The questioning for the NDP caucus has elapsed. We'll now move on to the PC caucus, where Ms. Sheehy Richard will continue questioning, and you have until 10:44.
Okay. I just wanted to go back where we finished up. You did really well answering in your 45 seconds that you had. And when we were talking about what kind of programs that the tourism industry operators were able to take advantage of, and you were talking about the digital. I just want to know what some of the performance indicators and evaluations your department will be looking at to assess the success of the grants for small to medium-sized tourism operators.
Deputy Huston?
Thank you for the question. So I should start out by saying that, Tourism Nova Scotia really, they've done an amazing amount of work over the last several years around really focused on research-based decision-making. So one of the key foundational aspects of any dollar invested, particularly when it comes to marketing, is that they do the work to understand that it will be a $20, for every dollar invested, there should be a $20 return in terms of influenced spending or decision here in the province. And so that's one of the key indicators that we look at, that's done by an independent third party every year to look at, based on the investments that were made in marketing, are we seeing a $20 or better return? And typically over the last couple, pre-COVID, we're seeing like closer to $23, $24 a year. Some of the other work that we do around indicators is around stakeholder surveys. So it's working directly with tourism operators, direct marketing organizations, and others that are either directly or indirectly involved within the tourism sector. And so we will do an annual survey with them to understand their satisfaction survey, particularly of the different programs that are being run through Tourism Nova Scotia. And happy to say that, based on from 2016, I think the number was about 6.6 or close to 7 out of 10 folks thought that we were doing a good job, and now it's closer to 8 out of 10. And so that's a market improvement, and that's something that we're always looking to see improve. I'll leave it there for now, but if there's other questions, I'm happy to answer.
Ms. Sheehy-Richard?
And then kind of still in tourism, but kind of film, a little bit of both, is how exciting it is and what better way to advertise what our province has to offer with having films be put into production here, because everybody wants to go watch that film, even in Nova Scotia, because we want to see our province in a movie. So with the increased cap under the Nova Scotia Film and Television Production Incentive Fund, which does make it easier for larger film productions to operate in Nova Scotia, how are these changes made, and how will the changes benefit the industry?
Deputy Huston?
Yeah, it's really exciting to be able to have that connection within a department and to sit down around the table with folks that are all working in the same department to have some of these discussions, these strategies, and then working with external stakeholders such as Screen Nova Scotia, Tourism Industry of Nova Scotia, and others. I'll start out by at a high level, and I'll hand it over to Chris in more specifics. But one of the things I'll give you as an example that, the Titanic, that movie still drives tourism here in Nova Scotia. We have a lot of visitors that come off of cruise ships that go directly to the Museum of the Atlantic to visit the Titanic exhibit, or to visit cemeteries downtown because of the final resting place of some of the victims of the Titanic disaster. So one of the things that we're looking at with our tourism folks and tie-ins is, can we do a better job of making direct connections between a series that's filmed? So let's take the Book of Negroes, for example, which spurred a lot of tourism in Southwest Nova and in Nova Scotia because of the success of that book and the movie. Can we look preemptively when we know production is coming to Nova Scotia? Can we start sowing the seeds for tourism experiences that link to that film that's coming out? I'll hand it over to you, Chris, to talk a little bit more specifics around that. Oak Island is another great example. Most popular show right now on the History Channel, and it has spurred a bunch of local tourism opportunities there for people who want to visit.
Mr. Shore?
So we've developed, and to what Deputy just referred to, so we have an internal working group with my division, which handles funding for the film industry and tourism. And tie-ins and Screen Nova Scotia. So we've already begun work on the development of a film tourism program, right, and initiatives. And we've had meetings to date with a number of experts in the industry who have developed ways of not only using the assets that we have now, so not just an Oak Island, for example, #1 rated show on History Channel. There are tourism operators that actually operate in and around Oak Island that attract a significant number of people every year to that part of the province. But additionally, also looking at new and innovative ways that we can team up with film production companies in order to market Nova Scotia. So it's not just about necessarily a destination, as in Oak Island is very specific to that part of the province, but it's also related to the type of marketing a film that you might attract to Nova Scotia and the type of visitor that you might attract. So an example would be, for instance, recently, Washington Black was a significantly large production that was just wrapped filming not that long ago, and to kind of take advantage of the fact that they were there, but also moving forward in the marketing of that production for Disney, how can we take advantage of and team up with Disney to kind of work together towards bringing people together and making an awareness of the fact that they shot here in Nova Scotia. So there's a lot of very, very interesting work moving forward that I think is really going to help the tourism industry, especially in shoulder seasons.
Ms. Sheehy-Richard?
Thank you. I think it's just phenomenal what it does do for our communities. Sometimes your host gets a little bit of a facelift because they want to show it on a street, or, you know, all your restaurants are all of a sudden packed full with people. So I'm a big fan of the film industry, and I'm just really happy to hear the collaboration that's happening within the department with the tourism and film together. I think I'll pass it on to MLA. Forget your name.
Mr. McDonald, you have 4 minutes.
Jeez, I guess the conference was good. You forgot me when I was there. Thanks to everybody for coming. Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to comment that I like the point that you're not looking at one size fits all for any application, because you're right, depending on the size, depends onto it. However, natural resources seems to be ignored, so I'm going to ask them questions. To the Deputy Minister. So the AG recommendation established performance indicators for all of your programs. How did you go about getting those done? And can you give us a couple examples?
Deputy Gatien.
Sorry. So as I explained earlier, we started with 3 and then expanded to the 6. So we began with a risk assessment using our risk management policy. And then we developed logic models for each of the programs so that we could kind of lay out, okay, what is this program really trying to achieve? What are the activities? What's the intent of it? What are the outputs and outcomes that we're looking for? And then you kind of have a visual map of what it is you're looking for. And then we also, at the same time, developed an operating program and guidelines as well, so that we could give proponents clear direction around, this is what we're looking for from this program. These are what we are looking for in terms of performance when you submit your evaluations to us and your reporting. We also, I know at least one of the programs, the Forest Nova Scotia program, didn't have a clear, this was before my time, so I'm going back in history a little bit here, but there wasn't a clear kind of agreement. So we developed a clear agreement so that they knew up front, this is what we're looking for in terms of meeting the performance indicators when you submit your evaluation reports or annual reports to us. So it's really a process, and it has to be iterative, right? So as the demands of government may change, and I mean, we do everything from funding for silviculture to now with our Energy and Mines group, we're also, of course, providing funding to, Efficiency Nova Scotia and Glean Nova Scotia for very different types of programs. So, and scholarships to individuals in the mining groups. So, it really has to be a kind of a what works for the intent of the program and the proponents that will be accessing it.
Mr. McDonald, you have 1.5 minutes.
Okay.
I misspoke early. It's 43.
Oh, okay. No problem, Madam Chair. So and it's back to the Deputy Minister, what does regular evaluations of your programs look like, and how often do you do it?
Deputy Gatien.
So just for clarification, are you talking about the evaluation of the funding we give to an organization or the overall grant program?
Mr. McDonald.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Overall grant program.
Deputy Gatien.
Thank you. So because we just did the 9, I guess it is, from the previous natural resources, and now we're moving to energy and mines, this will be the first go through for those. Obviously, every year as we look at the evaluation reports or the annual reports, depending on the organization, when they provide that to us at the end of their period of time, if there's something that we would notice that, oh, this isn't quite working. You know, of course, we would review it, but at this point, we're going to try to go through everything, and then I would expect putting it on a cycle of like a 3 to 5, I think somebody mentioned before, would be put on a cycle, maybe a 3 to 5 year period to say, okay, let's revisit this, and that will always depend, of course, on government priorities if they were to change, and we would have to look at things differently.
Time for questioning has elapsed. Do any of the deputies have any closing remarks they would like to make? Deputy Huston?
Well, since I've talked so much today, I think I'll just talk a little bit more. Well, one thing that I didn't mention earlier, and I thought it might come up in questions, but I want to emphasize is that, you know, we take the OAG's recommendations seriously. We've completed one of the 4, but we're on track to finish all of them by the end of this fiscal year. So we're well underway, and I think we would have been finished either a year or 2 ago had COVID not hit. But I just want to report that we are on track, and we accept all the recommendations, and we're going to be making those changes to come into compliance with those recommendations by the end of fiscal.
Do any of the other deputies wish to make remarks? Deputy Dean?
I'd just like to thank you all for the questions, because you have raised some other ideas that we can use as we finalize the policy. So it's been very helpful for us. And again, we're always grateful for input, and the departments will be providing us with further input. And we aim to finalize this policy by the end of the calendar year. So thank you.
Thank you. Deputy Gatien.
Yeah, just not to repeat again, but thank you very much for your questions. I found them personally very helpful too, as I'm relatively still new to the file, but as we go through the process of reviewing the additional programs, your comments, your questions will be of great help to me, so thank you very much.
Thank you to all of our witnesses here this morning. Thank you so much for your answers, and you are free to leave. We'll just carry on with committee business. Thank you very much. Good to see you all. Take care. Mr. Boudreau?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just while the witnesses are leaving, could we take maybe a 3 to 5 minute recess?
We can?
Yeah.
Thank you. 3 minutes? 3 minutes, okay? Order. So we now will move into the committee business portion of our meeting. We have, my understanding is there is a motion coming forward. I believe it is, has it been distributed? Yes, okay, it has been distributed. Ms. LeBlanc.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, I'd like to move that Kendra Coombs, the member for Cape Breton Centre Whitney Pier, have the ability to attend public accounts meetings virtually 2 times per month, and while attending virtually, be allowed to vote on motions and be counted toward the quorum in the room. And this would continue for the period in which she is nursing her new baby.
Okay, I just want to note that if any of those meetings are in camera, and they normally take place over in the committee meetings, they have problems with doing a hybrid meeting, I think. So just, we'll double check that, but I just wanted to lay that out there. That's the only caveat that I see as a problem. Is there any discussion on this particular motion? No discussion. All in favor, please say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. And the motion is carried. Okay, now we will move along to correspondence. And previously, our crack clerk, has distributed 6 pieces of email to us, I think on 3 occasions. She has sent them out. So there was correspondence from the Department of Environment and Climate Change, information requested from the June 15th meeting, Office of the Auditor General 21-22 Performance Report and 22-23 Business Plan, the Department of Justice, information requested from May 25th meeting, the North End Community Health Center, information requested from the May 11th meeting, Department of Municipal Affairs and Housing, information requested from the June 29th meeting, and the Department of Municipal Affairs and Housing, information requested from the March 2nd meeting. Is there any discussion about the correspondence that has been received? Hearing none, we will take all of that information into account. Now we have a couple of items on the agenda as well, the continuation of, as well as some additional training. So in addition to the ongoing training that's been provided by the Auditor General, the Canadian Audit and Accountability Foundation is also available to provide training. I think those of us who attended the conference in Ottawa this past week heard that a number of different jurisdictions have availed themselves of this particular training. And we had previously discussed having a training session with the CAAF, but decided to wait until the committee had been operating for some time. So at present, October 19th, 26th, and November 2nd have no meetings scheduled. So one of these dates is available to provide training to the committee. And I was just wondering, would folks like to have that training? Or are there any concerns, any discussion here? Ms. LeBlanc?
I just want to say, as someone else who did go to the national conference in Ottawa, that I am fully excited by the CAAF and fully support the idea of them coming for training. It would be awesome if we were in the room with them, if that was possible. Mm-hmm. I think that would be more effective. And I will just note that, well, maybe I shouldn't. I don't know if that was a in-camera discussion or whatever. But anyway, there's a move afoot to. For there to be opportunities for yearly training, in fact, from the CAF, and I think that we would benefit from a yearly meeting with them. I would even think that it would be great if we had more than 2 hours, like if we could do, a more substantial thing.
Okay, we will we'll have a further conversation with CAF and find out how long their training lasts when they come down to do that kind of thing. Mr. McDonald? Mr. McDonald? There we go.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm in agreement. The only thing is I prefer if it wasn't November 2nd. I've got something that morning, so if it comes in.
So not November 2nd, but...
Preferably. I don't.
Okay, but the 19th and 26th are good for you?
Yes, ma'am.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. So I guess I'll just ask that the members signify by saying aye that they're open to further training with the CAAF, but not on November 2nd. All those in favor, please say aye. Thank you. So does the committee wish to set up another training session with the Auditor General to continue our work that we started on the issue of statement of purpose, et cetera? I'm open to hearing some discussion about that. Ms. Sheehy-Richard.
I think that just from being on the conference and some of the discussions that were held, I would think that maybe our training with the CAAF might be good to do that first and then. So if we could have them in on the 19th and then, I don't know if we want to do it back to back, but it might work out better.
Okay. All right. And Mr. Young?
Yeah, I don't know if this is a possibility, but the sooner the better would be good, especially with everyone coming back with information and stuff from the conference in Ottawa. I would like to see if there's any possibility to have a training session sooner than later, especially as we're going on agenda setting. And I think it'd be a good opportunity for us to look at some of the topics there and see if they fit within the mandates and the purpose of the PAC. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm hearing that Mr. Young would like it to be sooner rather than later. Ms. Langell?
So do you mean other than those 2 dates that the CAF are coming, like before that or after? We're talking about the AG situation now, yeah.
Mr. Young?
And I believe our next meeting is that an in-camera meeting to review a report? Perhaps there's opportunity within that time to discuss a training session as well. Just throwing that out there. I don't know anybody's schedule. I see nods over there.
So in terms of our next meeting, not next week, but the week after is
with the Auditor General on the report that's coming out, yes.
Is a meeting with the Auditor General. So she will have released it the day before, and then we have our next meeting with her. And so we could piggyback on the back of that, further training with the Auditor General, or sorry, not further training, further discussion of the statement of purpose, et cetera. Is our members in favor of that? That would be the 21st of September? Yes, yeah. Are members in favor of that? All those in favor, please indicate by saying aye. Aye. Contrary-minded, nay. And I realize I didn't ask contrary-minded on the last vote, but everybody said aye, so that's why I didn't, just so you know. Okay, so with that said, surprise, surprise. Our next meeting date is September 21st. It's in camera with the Office of the Auditor General to discuss the 2022 report of the Auditor General regarding healthy eating in schools. If there is no further business, any further business, then I will now adjourn the meeting. And the meeting is adjourned.